Hi guys, welcome to lesson 2 where we're going to talk about solve using square roots. And if you'll notice, I have this big plus or minus sign, and I want you to remember that you are always going to have two answers, and plus or minus is going to be a big part of that. So that's why I made these really big. Okay, so I want to start off with what type of problem would you use solving by square roots? So I want you to notice, I went ahead and wrote down an example. The first thing that I want you to notice is that this doesn't have, when it's in this form, it doesn't have just like an x. It has like an x squared and it has a number, but it doesn't have an x term. So that's a big hint that you're going to solve by square roots. Okay, so I went ahead and added this down here. So if it can be written in the form like a number x squared equals another number, that is like a big hint that you're going to solve in square root. So this is something that you could do that. So usually we're going to set it equal to 0, but in this case we don't want to. We're going to add that number over. So it's going to look like that. So if I told you, if you had like 5x equals 180, and I told you to solve for x, what would you do? You would solve by dividing by 5. That's what we're going to do here. This is just, we're going to treat this as just like that 2 isn't there until the very, very end. So I'm going to take 180 divided by 5, and that's going to be 36. And then our new step is I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So when you take the square root of 36, you get 6. But if it's an equation, you also get a negative 6. So let's kind of look at this. If I had x squared equals 4, that's the same thing as x times x equals 4. So if I ask you, okay, well, what number would work for x? Well, if I plug in 2 times 2 equals 4, so 2 would work, so x is equal to 2. But also, if I plugged in negative 2, wouldn't that work? Negative 2 times negative 2 is also a positive 4. So when you're solving equations using square roots, you always have to include the positive and the negative. This is a big deal. So our final answer here is positive 6 and negative 6. But these are going to get a little bit more complicated as we go along. So let's try this. So remember, forget about the squared right now. So if I said, okay, well, how would you solve for x? I'm going to divide by 2. I'm going to bring the x squared back in. So I have x squared is equal to 4. So now I'm going to undo the squared by taking the square root of both sides. When I take the square root of both sides, that cancels out, like we talked about yesterday. That just becomes an x. And then over here, the square root of 4 is 2, but I also need to include the negative 2. So I have two answers there. Okay, let's do this one. So I'm going to add 18 to both sides because, again, I'm forgetting about that squared, and I'm going to have n squared is equal to 0. When I take the square root of both sides, you really don't have a positive or negative 0. It's just 0. So this is really the only time you'll have one answer. Okay, let's do this one. So when I subtract 12, I get a negative answer. I get a negative 7. So guys, I need you to be mindful. If you take the square root of a negative 7, it's going to give you an imaginary number. And so you'll talk about that next year. So our answer, we just can't take this any further. You can't take the square root of a negative number and get like a real number. So I'm going to say no real solution. And that's going to be my answer for that one. So if you'll notice, there's only 3 types of possible answers, and I've shown you all 3. So the first one is going to be 2 answers or 2 solutions. The second one is going to be 1 answer or 1 solution. And the third one is going to be no answers or no solution. And I'm going to say no real solution because there is a solution, but it just involves numbers that we're not going to talk about yet in Algebra 1B. Okay, so the next part, what if we have a fraction? So let's look at this. So if I took this 9 divided by 4, and that's going to be a yucky decimal, but think about this. If I took the square root of 9 over 4, do you see how I could take a little square root of 9 and a little square root of 4? That still counts. So I'm going to have z is equal, square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2. And then that plus or minus does not go away. So I have z equals positive 3 over 2 and z equals negative 3 over 2. Okay, let's do this one. So if I divide by 16, I would get a yucky decimal. So I'm not going to look at it as a decimal. I'm going to look at it as taking the square root of the whole thing, but I'm going to look at it as taking the square root on the top and the square root of the bottom. So I have x equals, let's see, positive 5 over 4 and x equals negative 5 over 4 for my two answers. Okay, so let's keep going. We're going to continue on with this one. So I'm going to add 11 and I get 18 on the other side. So again, I'm forgetting about the square, so I'm just going to divide by 3, and I just want to get that x squared by itself. So when I do that, I get x squared equals 6. And if I take the square root of both of these, I really can't simplify 6 anymore. So I'm just going to call it x equals positive square root of 6 and x equals negative square root of 6. If you had to like give a decimal equivalent, you could. So I just want you to and so like if you see this on the EOC and it doesn't give it to you as this, it gives it to you as a yucky decimal, just make sure you might need to push the little like arrow buttons to change it to a decimal, but it should be around 2.45. And then obviously that would be a negative 2.45. So those are your possibilities of what they would look like. Okay, for these last two, notice I said that you won't see an x. You actually will here, but it's kind of protected in parentheses. So I'm going to look at this problem as like 6x squared equals 42, because I don't really care what's in here right now. So how would you solve for x? I'm going to divide by 6. So I'm starting out there. I'm going to divide by 6, and I get x minus, now I forgot what it was. Let's see, x minus 4 squared is equal to 7. Okay, now anytime you have a squared, the way to undo that is by taking a square root. So those, just like we talked about in class, those are going to cancel out, and I get x minus 4 is equal to positive 7, and x minus 4 is equal to negative, sorry, I think I said 7, square root of 7. And then my last step is I'm going to, so this is like a positive, that's going to help us if I put the little plus there, because I'm going to add 4 to both sides, and I'm going to do the same thing here. And so when you do that, this 4 is not going to be, it's not just going to go right out in front. We have to separate that with a plus. So 4 plus square root of 7. And in this case, it's going to be 4 minus square root of 7. So you're always going to separate it with a plus and a minus. Okay, so let's do this one. So this is x minus 2 squared is equal to 9. And then now to undo that squared, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I get x minus 2 is equal to 3, and x minus 2 is equal to negative 3. Okay, so I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and I get x is equal to 5. And over here, I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and I get x is equal to negative 1. And that is it.